Today we're going to begin by looking at Soren Kierkegaard, and we're going to look at one of his very short essays, The Present Age, which I think is a very great way to introduce his thought as a whole, because it allows you to see some of the basic themes, not only for Kierkegaard, but for the existentialist movement in philosophy and literature in general. Some of the basic themes that are going to come up over and over again. And you see how Kierkegaard fits them into some of his discussions of publicity and the sort of age that we're, according to his diagnosis, currently in. It introduces another important theme of his, the dimension of the religious, without going too far into its complexities. So this is a really great piece for starting to read Kierkegaard. Oftentimes people start with Fear and Trembling or The Sickness Unto Death or things like that. I think this is actually the best one to begin with. In it he's asking this question, and he's answering it of course, what is the present age? What is the moment in time or the epoch or the way of life, the structuring of society, of human consciousness, of all of the opportunities and possibilities that are afforded to us. What is that? And I think that, given that this essay is almost 200 years old, it's worth thinking about this question. Can this actually apply here in the present? Does this diagnosis of the situation fit just as well in our time, or are there things that would have to be left out? Or another possibility is Kierkegaard actually onto something that may have shown him to be prescient, to be looking ahead, to be seeing our time in certain ways even better than his own time. I actually think that's the case. But we'll see why in a moment. And then, if we want to think about that, we have to ask, how would we actually conceptualize the present age? How would we get a handle on our own time? Well, the only way that we can do that is by having some points of comparison. We can compare present situations to what we can imagine. So we have the real, or at least our interpretation of the real, and then some sort of imaginary. It could be a dystopia, it could be a utopia. That's one possibility. You may have some criteria afforded by some moral theory or some other stance that allows you to critique the present age. But in general, we have to look at the relationship to the past. And this is something very interesting that's been pointed out about modernity and even about late modernity and what some people want to call postmodernity. That one of the things that takes place is not just a contrast of the past, but a losing of the past. A losing of a certain relationship with the past. And that doesn't necessarily occur at the highest cultural levels, but it does occur for the masses of people. So Kierkegaard is going to be pointing things out here in relation to the past, but also in relation to the present possibilities, towards a side of the present that is being overlooked, being left out, not being seen, in part because it's not so easy to figure. It requires that one commit oneself, that there be an experiential, an existential component to it. And we'll get to that in a moment as well. I just want to raise some of these beginning questions. Here's another question that you have to ask. What does the present age, what does the way things are now mean for an individual human person? And you have to ask that in several different ways. One is very general. What does it mean for an individual per se, not necessarily this individual or that individual? But you notice that's a very abstract way of putting it. And again, Kierkegaard is an existentialist, so he's very comfortable with and would actually see it as essential to doing genuine philosophy, to say, what does it mean for me existentially in my concrete situation? Again, this takes us to this question of is this applicable now to us in the new millennium as it was for Kierkegaard writing in the early 19th century. What does the present age and the way that it's structured, what does it allow me? What does it open up for me? What does it close off for me? What directions does it steer me in? Has it steered me wrong? Has it given me a sense of sufficiency where there isn't sufficiency? Has it given me desires that I ought not to have? Has it given me ways of assessing and evaluating things that are in certain ways false? Or is this, an age of milk and honey where we've actually realized truth and everything is so much better now than it used to be? These are real questions that have to be asked and answered if you want to, think of going back to the ancient Socratic dictum, know thyself, and to examine your life. If you want to examine your life and you want to live an examined life, you have to do so by thinking about not just yourself, not just your actions, but the time that you live in, the environment that you're in. Not just the surroundings, but the moral environment. The ways in which it allows you to develop as a person, what it tells you are right and wrong, the possibilities for action, for development that it affords you. Or you might even think of it in terms of the openings, perhaps possibilities in the sense of, this is the way that you ought to go, and we make this possible for you, we open it up. Maybe those aren't the same thing as openings, where one, through action, seizes an opportunity that's being overlooked by, you might say, the official party line. So all of that said by way of preliminary, what is the present age? What is determinative of it? Kierkegaard thinks that to answer this question, the present age is one of the public. It's one of, you might say, the press. That's where the sort of limit point of the public goes. It's an age of association. It's an age of, in some ways, rebellion and revolt that has gone on so long that there's not that much to actually rebel and revolt against in that classic sense. And that was even going on in his own time, even more in ours. And the public is composed of individuals. So there's going to be this contrast between the public and the individual. In this book, The Present Age. And the public, or the mode of being, the mode of existence, the environment that the public creates, conditions the possibility for individuality, for being a true individual as Kierkegaard sees it, which has nothing to do with being eccentric, nothing to do with expressing oneself. It has something to do with something a bit deeper than that, and we're going to see what that is in a moment. I want to read you a passage from the very end of this before we get to developing this further. He says, when the generation, which itself desired to level and to be emancipated, to destroy authority and at the same time itself has, through the skepticism of the principal association, started the hopeless forest fire of abstraction, when as a result of leveling with this skepticism, this generation has rid itself of the individual and everything organic and concrete, and put in its place humanity and the numerical equality of man and man, when the generation has for a moment delighted in this unlimited panorama of abstract infinity, unrelieved by even the smallest eminence, undisturbed by even the slightest interest, a sea of desert, then the time has come for work to begin. For every individual must work for himself, each for himself. No longer can the individual, as in former times, turn to the great for help when he grows confused. That is past. He is either lost in the dizziness of unending abstraction, or saved forever in the reality of religion. That is the dilemma, the choice, the alternative that Kierkegaard sets out. And so our goal here is actually going to be trying to get ourselves to that end point where that alternative can be figured. So in order to do that, we have to think about the diagnosis that Kierkegaard produces of the present age. What is going on? How does the public get generated? Well, he calls this the age of level, making everything at the same level. And if you think about this, this is worth dwelling on for a moment. There are different ways in which you can level things out. And there are different types of things that can be leveled. So, let's think first of all about topography, right? There's hills, there's valleys. Take the hills, throw them in the valleys, and now you've got a level plain, and everything is on the same basic stratum. That would be leveling. You can take numbers and add and subtract, or divide them, multiply them, and they wouldn't remain the same numbers anymore, would they? But you would end up with the things that you're working with being leveled. What about with people? Now it starts to get more complicated, because human beings are inherently more complicated than all other types of being. What does it mean to talk about leveling things? I mean, we talk about equal rights. That's a kind of leveling. It's a way of saying everybody should be placed on the same playing field, whether the right has to do with, say, freedom from search and seizure, or being allowed to vote, or having opportunities provided to one. Now you notice as soon as we start doing this, every time that we start pushing things down or lifting things up, it starts to change the whole system, and other aspects, other dimensions end up being unleveled as well. So leveling itself is a controversial process and goal. And even the nature of what counts as leveling is not always clear. But there's one thing that you can say that is clearly ingrained in modern liberal democratic society, which is this notion that whether you call it all people are created equal, or everybody ought to be afforded the same rights, or however you want to look at it, that we are all in some important respect on the same ground. So one person's voice ought not count for more, unless perhaps they're able to convince other people through argument or through offering evidence or things like that. That's the sort of ideal that we live out. It used to be that there were more authorities in more traditional societies accepted on the basis of being authorities. Modernity is in the age where everybody's constantly asking, by what right do you tell me that? Who are you to put your opinion across? Who are you to set yourself here and me or that onlooker or whoever down here? And that reaction is basically a leveling reaction. And Kierkegaard doesn't see that as necessarily bad. He's not saying, well, we need to go back to a time when very few people could vote, or very few people got to speak their minds, or anything like that. What he's noting as a philosopher are the effects of this. And there are unintended consequences to this. There's sort of a process by which things get out of control a bit. Like something is set into motion. This is very common in history. Somebody wants to make some changes for the good, and some other things get set into motion which are larger, more structural, harder to wrap our heads around, but which affect us, affect our way of being in the world, our way of existing. Kierkegaard sees this in his time as tied in very much with what he calls publicity or the press. The press It's not just a body of people out there. It's a way of approaching truth. It's a way of approaching reality. It's a way of approaching what it is that we claim to know or value or pay attention to. And the press allows something to take place for the first time that wasn't able to occur in previous kinds of societies. So representation, the ways in which things are actually being reported or presented or have some sort of representation, some sort of figuration in somebody else's press, in somebody else's publicly saying so, in somebody else's, we would say in our time, somebody else's web page, a blog, a newspaper. Things begin to exist and to matter insofar as they appear within some sort of medium. Now notice there's a reversal taking place here. Originally, you would think, and we still have this sort of ideology that we teach journalism students, that the press doesn't make reality, it just reports reality. And it responds to the importance of things rather than sort of spinning it and changing the importance of things. It doesn't interpret reality, it goes out and tries to investigate it and find it and then report it back. And this would apply, to investigative reporting. This would apply to, say, entertainment, or all these other sorts of things that we do with media. Well, is that really true? It's interesting. If you look at the history of advertisements, early advertisements were actually very boring. And the reason that they were very boring is because they actually tried to just report the product and its price and its quality. They didn't try to fluff it. They didn't try to spin it. They didn't try to change anything. And they weren't competing against each other either. They weren't saying, let's compare brand X to our brand or anything like that. That changed over time. With advertising, it's very clear that the process altered, and eventually the advertising itself was pushing the products. Actually, a lot of the cost of products is advertising. Now, what about other reporting? What about, and I'm not just talking about reporting events, but talking about the importance of, say, cultural productions. Where do we go for that? How do we know if we should see a movie or if a book is worth reading? Well, we look for a review. And if it hasn't been reviewed at all, well, what does that mean? Very few people have actually paid attention to it, which means it may not actually be very important. How do we know it actually is important? Well, we rely on the public. And this is a leveling process, because there's this notion that, well, you just look at what a lot of people together say, and they're almost anonymous. But the more of them that are involved, the better, because each one of their votes counts for the same, or each one of their opinions counts for the same. Ultimately, it's saying that mass counts because the individual really doesn't count. Nobody's opinion is better than anybody else's, except insofar as it fits in with that of the crowd. And Kierkegaard talks about people sort of falling into this thing that he calls the crowd, which is a form of irresponsibility, which we'll talk about in a later section. That's a way in which people can be active. He talks about them associating with each other. That allows them agency, that allows them activity, that allows them in some ways to feel alive, to feel like they matter. Because one of the things that's going on with leveling is if individuals don't really matter, except insofar as they fit into somebody else's view, somebody else's sight, then along with that goes a kind of feeling, an emotion, a mood of things being empty. Something almost corresponding to, the book of Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanity, all is vanity. but nothing quite so dramatic as that, just daily life. So individuals find their activity in the crowd, in association. People also find that they exist in the eyes of the crowd, in the eyes of the public. And they begin to take their cues for who they are and what value they have from the public. So this generates a situation in which, if you think about it, individuals become extremely vulnerable. Oftentimes we would talk about ancient societies and medieval societies, or non-modernized societies as having a set of cultural mores which they sort of push onto the individual. The individual ends up sort of assimilating these or identifying with these or making them part of themselves, and therefore changing themselves in the process. That's a relatively benign process compared to finding that you only exist or feel like you exist or can conceive that you exist and have value in the eyes of what other people say, not in yourself. That's a pretty dangerous place to inhabit, and that's a place where a lot of people are in modernity. Notice this is self-reinforcing, because if you have that feeling, you're going to seek out the crowd. You're going to become part of the crowd. You're going to subordinate whatever eccentricities or parts of yourself that have escaped sort of a homogenization that comes about through the leveling process. You're going to get rid of that so that you can fit in. Kierkegaard was looking at this in his own time. I think this is just as big of a problem in our time, maybe exacerbated by the just permeation and penetration of media everywhere that we look, including the social media. Let's look now at the contrast that he produces between the past age, his point of reference, and the present age. He says that, this is going back to the very beginning of it, in the earlier stages of our culture, our development, it says the dialectic of antiquity tended towards leadership, the great individual and the masses, the free man and the slaves. So this is a common sort of Hegelian position. Hegel said that in the ancient world, one man was free, and then of course everyone was slaves under him. He impressed things onto them. With Christianity comes in the notion that all men are free, and then Hegel saw it as with modern, the Protestant Reformation, the dawn of modernity, and the ongoing effects of the Enlightenment. All men could be free. Kierkegaard is reacting to that, but he's acknowledging it at the same time. So in antiquity, what you had were very stratified societies in which people could move, but not too many people could be on the top. And the people who were on the top made value. They decided what other people had to do. They got to set the agenda, you might say. And people would look up to them. People would want to be like them. And oftentimes people would strive to fit in into something that the people from on top could impose on the bottom. And then he says, in Christendom, the dialectic of Christendom tends towards representation. The majority sees itself in its representative and is set free by the consciousness that it is the majority which is represented, in a sort of self-consciousness. So there's something different that comes about through Christianity. And I don't want to go too deep into this, but culturally that's quite true. I mean, it doesn't matter whose philosophy you're actually looking at, whether you see Christianity coming into the Roman Empire as a good thing or a bad thing. It certainly did transform social consciousness, and it certainly did transform the category of the individual. Did it totally radically do that? Were there no prefigurations, say, in Stoicism? No, that's not quite true. But it made it something that was widespread. It made it sort of the default starting point for people. Because in Christianity, if you actually took it seriously, you existed as a person in the eyes of God, even if you were just a slave, sweeping the ground. You still had some value, whereas in the ancient pagan world, you really didn't. You had value insofar as you could ascend the rung of status. He says the dialectic of the present age tends towards equality, and its most logical, though mistaken, fulfillment is leveling, as the negative relationship of the particular units to each other. I'm going to get to equality in a moment. I do want to talk about a few other contrasts that come up with this. He talks about in the ancient world, in the medieval world, in the world before modernity had really set in and the processes had gotten underway. He says, he's comparing this. He says, the individual no longer belongs to God, to himself, to his beloved, to his art, or to his science. He's conscious of belonging in all things to an abstraction to which he's subjected by reflection, just as a serf belongs to an estate. So, in the past, one could find their value, one could find their meaning through relationship, concrete relationship with somebody else. God, for instance, that's central to Christianity. To oneself, to one's beloved, to one's discipline, one's art or one's science. The leveling process takes that away. The leveling process subordinates the individual to something less easy to figure, less easy to point at, something more abstract, something bloodless, you might say. Modern equality, the way Kierkegaard sees it, is a sort of interchangeability. Insofar as we become completely equal, we abstract away from the individuality of the individual, the personality of the person, you might say. What it is that makes me me, what it is that makes you you. We get away from that. And that's a dangerous thing to do, because as soon as we do that, why have me there? Why not just shuffle me off and put somebody else in my place? If we are truly all completely equal in every respect, then none of us have any value. It's ironic, because the leveling process gets started by sort of recognizing the value of that which has not been valued. If we say that it was unfair that not everybody could vote, that we want to have universal suffrage, that we want to let everybody vote, we're asserting that some people have value who have not been treated as if they had value. The effect of that, though, is something different. Just because you have a good intention doesn't mean that it has overall a good effect on the culture. So in modern equality, things become interchangeable. The individual becomes, in certain ways, isolated. It becomes less than an individual. He talks, this is a great phrase, he says, the individual in the masses in antiquity had no importance whatsoever. The outstanding individual signified them all. The present age tends towards a mathematical equality in which it takes so and so many to make one individual. That's a brilliant way to put it. We're almost living a fractional life. Instead of being able to take a stand and say, here's where I myself am taking responsibility, and I will act as an individual. We want to associate, we want to have the comfort of having people behind us, because we don't feel ourselves to be whole enough to take a stand. We need not just the comfort, but the reliability, the being told that we're on the right track by other people. And that tends to be this amorphous, faceless public. He says, quite consistently, people add themselves together for the most trivial purposes. Simply in order to put a passing whim into practice, a few people add themselves together and the thing is done. Then they dare do it. So this is a failure of nerve, a failure of courage at a deep level. He's not using the word courage here, but I think that it does make sense to talk about this. He also talks about people uniting together. He says the fact that people united together have the courage to meet death does not nowadays mean that each individually has the courage. So now he's explicitly talking about this. For even more than death, the individual fears the judgment and protest of reflection upon his wishing to risk something on his own. Now you notice I've used this word reflection many times. This is a technical philosophical term. It means thinking about oneself, or thinking upon oneself, or upon one's actions, thinking about one's own thinking. And what's the connection to the public? Does the public reflect? Not really. The public just sort of, meanders around and comes up with what it comes up with. But the individual, taking the public as the criterion for whether they're doing the right thing, whether they're doing the wrong thing, whether their things are true or false, whether they should believe or not believe, they are engaged in a process of reflection in which they internalize the public, this abstract public, and they worry about what would people say. Anytime that the individual is asking themselves, what would people say? Not just what would this person say, what would that person say who I care about, what would that person say who I actually dislike and maybe want to vex or something like that. Instead of asking that, asking what would they say? What would people say? What if somebody found out about this? They are engaging in a process of reflection on the abstraction that is the public. This is Kierkegaard's view of this. There's something amiss. There's something missing in all of this, something gnawing, something wrong. And Kierkegaard uses the word crisis in talking about this ongoing leveling process. Let's see how we get there. He says, the leveling process is not the action of an individual, but the work of reflection in the hands of an abstract power. You can calculate it. You can sort of figure out where it's going to go because of that. The individual who levels down is himself engulfed in the process. Leveling cannot just be somebody coming along and saying, okay, now all of you are equal. This is a really important insight. It's something that the individual chooses to do to him or herself in order to conform themselves to this crowd, the public, these other individuals who have, you might say, bought in. So the individual levels himself as himself engulfed in the process, and while he seems to know selfishly what he's doing, one can only say of people en masse that they know not what they do. For just as collective enthusiasm produces a surplus which does not come from the individual, there is also a surplus in this case. There's a meaning that gets produced when you put a lot of people together who are sort of, along this line, fairly conformist, who are looking to other people. But none of them are responsible for it. It takes on a life of its own, you might say. Let's look at another feature of this leveling process. Is it possible to stop it? Could we turn it back? Kierkegaard is nostalgic in a sense, in that he is looking to a previous age and saying, things were in some respects better then. But he's not nostalgic in the sense of saying, we need to go back to that. He's saying, that's gone. We can't recover that. What we can do is what's possible in the present. He says, who could stop the leveling process? Let's look at individuals first. No single individual, and I mean no outstanding individual in the sense of leadership, will be able to arrest the abstract process of leveling, for it's negatively something higher, and the age of chivalry is gone. No one individual can hold back this tide, can make it stop. We're stuck with we're stuck with the process of leveling. We're stuck with the age that it's produced. No society or association can arrest that abstract power, simply because an association is itself in the service of the leveling process. Modern forms of association are not going, you couldn't form a club to stop leveling, because as soon as you've got a club, a modern form of association, a voluntary organization, as Locke calls it, even perhaps what de Tocqueville called these intermediate associations, about which he was more optimistic than Kierkegaard appears to be. As soon as you form one of those, you are actually engaged in the process of leveling, according to Kierkegaard. So that can't stop it either. Not even the individuality of the different nationalities can arrest it, so nationalism can't deal with this. For on a higher plane, the abstract process of leveling is a negative representation of humanity, pure and unalloyed. This is a very interesting thing to say. The leveling process is something that came about historically. It shows us something that is part of our human nature. It's real. It was waiting there to be revealed, to be unfolded. And it's not the whole of who we are. That's the good news. If it were, then that would be very bad news indeed. But if it were, then we couldn't even conceive something different. So it is, like it says, a representation, a negative representation of humanity. The abstract leveling process, that self-combustion of the human race produced by the friction which arises when the individual ceases to exist as singled out by religion, is bound to continue like a trade wind and consume everything. So this is the age that we're stuck with. Nothing can stop this process on its own grounds. You could never beat leveling in a popularity contest, you might say. What does it do to the principle of individuality? Well, he says the principle of individuality in its immediate and beautiful formation symbolizes the generation, the outstanding and eminent individual. It was able to resist for a while. You can sort of emerge from it every once in a while, but you're not going to change the whole process, so it's still possible to resist. The principle of individuality, in its eternal truth, uses the abstraction and equality of the generation to level down, and in that way cooperates with it. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. It says the leveling process is as powerful where temporary things are concerned as it is impotent where eternal things are concerned. So here there's a moment of hope, you can say. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. I want to dwell a little bit more on what's going on with this leveling process. He says, in order that everything should be reduced to the same level, it's first of all necessary to procure a phantom, a spirit of monstrous abstraction, an all-embracing something which is nothing, a mirage, and that phantom is the public. It is only in an age which is without passion, yet reflective, that such a phantom can develop itself with the help of the press, which itself becomes an abstraction. And notice, this is another moment of hope as well. He says, in times of tumult and passion and enthusiasm, even when a people desire to realize a fruitless idea and lay waste and destroy everything, even then there's no such thing as a public. There are parties and they are concrete. So long as there actually is some conflict, even if it's crazy conflict, fruitless, unlikely to win, totally utopian, irrational, there's at least something going on that doesn't reach this sort of limit point. But get away from that. I think in late modern society, we can actually have these zones of conflict where limited meanings emerge for those who are involved in them, and they don't relate everything to the public. But then in the broader society, we do have this operation of the leveling process and the public going on. I think our society is actually like that. I think Kierkegaard would say that. It says the public is in fact the real leveling master rather than the actual leveler. For whenever leveling is only approximately accomplished, it is done by something. The leveling process always involves some group, some people, some activities, some forces working against other forces, and they don't realize that they can sort of be sucked into this process. They think they're only opposing this one issue, but actually, or they're trying to produce this one change, but actually what's going on is a much broader process that is going to actually remove even the meaning of what they're doing. He says, the public is a concept which could not have occurred in antiquity because the people en masse and corpore took part in any situation which arose and were responsible for the actions of the individual. Only when the sense of association in society is no longer strong enough to give life to concrete realities is the press able to create that abstraction, the public, consisting of unreal individuals who never are and never can be united in an actual situation or organization. If you think about some of the great controversies of our day, when somebody, let's take very simple things, when somebody is held up to be a great person or held to be a terrible person in the press, in the eyes of the public. When you get down to the level of the concrete, of real individuals, even of certain groups, certain interest associations, you will find that somebody can be held responsible for views. Somebody actually says, this is my view on this. But the public is larger than that. When somebody has become notorious, or when somebody has become celebrated, then there's an ascription of value going on that nobody's actually responsible for. And that happens through the press, through the operations of all these different kinds of media that we have. Things get passed on, ideas get promulgated, and eventually nobody knows where it came from. Nobody knows. All anybody knows is there's momentum going this way, so we better get in line with it, we better follow along with it. He says the public is a host more numerous than all the peoples together, but it is a body which can never be reviewed. This is a really critical point. The public, the crowd, people in associations, individuals who are leveling themselves and acting in accordance with this are in a certain sense irresponsible. The public bears no responsibility. Particular groups can, but they're not yet at the level of the public per se. Society, the they, to use Heidegger's famous form of talking about this. So, like he says, a generation, a people, an assembly of the people, a meeting, or a man are responsible for what they are and can be made ashamed if they are inconstant and unfaithful. But a public remains a public. A people, an assembly, or a man can change to such an extent that one may say they are no longer the same. The public, on the other hand, can become the very opposite and still be the same, a public. That's what it means for it to be an abstraction. It's not something that you can actually wrap your head or your heart or your arms around. And the public is completely irresponsible. So that means that individuals who take their cues from the public, who, like he says, the man who has no opinion of an event at the actual moment accepts the opinion of the majority, or if he's quarrelsome, of the minority. That sort of thing is sort of internalizing the public. And in doing so, one is actually oneself being irresponsible. Irresponsible not only to other people, but to oneself as an individual, and perhaps even to something higher than oneself. There is a great danger here. He talks about a great danger to individuals. He says, more and more individuals, owing to their bloodless indolence, will aspire to be nothing at all in order to become the public, that abstract whole formed in the most ludicrous way by all participants becoming a third party. This indolent mass which understands nothing and does nothing itself. And he goes on. He talks about it being sort of like a jaded Roman emperor, just waiting for more and more what? Entertainment, more and more news, more and more novelty, more and more things coming in on which it can pass judgment and then allow it to move on again. Nothing ends up having true value, really mattering. And an individual who ties him or herself in with that is going to be living, Kierkegaard thinks, a very empty life, not realizing something that is really important in human life. He figures this in terms of the religious. So this is where we now turn to talking about the relationship between the individual and God. He says that this current age presents us with an opportunity as well as a danger. He says that this abstract leveling process, it does level everything, but through it each individual for himself may receive once more a religious education. Not a religious education like catechesis, like, here's what you ought to believe or anything like that, but in certain respects a negative education. If the public is obsessed with something, that's probably not something good to be obsessed with. If Tiger Woods and his peccadillos are, in the pages, and then, debates about gay marriage are in the pages, that is probably not what Kierkegaard thinks that you ought to be occupying your mind with if you want to be a genuine individual. You probably need to think about what's not being talked about, what's falling through the cracks, what is in the interstices. So he says, an individual may receive once more religious education, and in the highest sense be helped by the examen rigorosum of the leveling process to an essentially religious attitude. For the younger men who, however strongly they personally may cling to what they admire as eminent, realize from the beginning that the leveling process is evil in both the selfish individual and in the selfish generation, but that it can also, if they desire it honestly and before God, become the starting point for the highest life. For then it will indeed be an education to live in the age of leveling. The age of leveling allows us to actually see the finiteness of temporary things. It doesn't tell us to look to eternity because it's hostile to eternity, because it can't even figure it or understand it. But it's doing us a favor by, you might say, removing the idols, by lowering them down. Even though it offers us, new ones. The ones that it offers aren't particularly good, particularly if we think about it in terms of those of the past and their pageantry and what they had to offer, to the passions, to the imagination of people. That's just not very good. If American Idol is the best we can do, forget it. That opens up the door for saying, there's something better. There's something more. I need to try to get a hold of this. And Kierkegaard says something really interesting. There's two other points about religion that I want to hit on. One is that he actually brings up the Reformation, and he criticizes those who would say, well, the Reformation happened, we just have to follow along those sorts of lines. He says, the Reformation produced heroes. The Reformation had a hero who paid God high enough for his position as hero. I think he has Luther in mind here. By joining up with him directly, people buy cheap, indeed at bargain prices, what he had paid for so dearly, but they do not buy the highest of things. And then he says, there's no good calling on a Holger Danske or a Martin Luther. Their day is over. And at bottom, it's only the individual's laziness which makes a man long to have them back, to be told what to do. Instead, Everybody has to work out their relationship to God in the age of leveling on their own. They can bring in things from other people, of course. They don't begin from a complete zero. But the age of leveling has brought it about that they're not stuck with looking at what this person has to say, what this church has to teach. They actually are now afforded the possibility of looking at it themselves without necessarily being committed and saying, I will commit to this. This is what I'm going to do. The last thing that I'm going to say about this, because now we're well into this notion of the religious for Kierkegaard, is from close to the end. He says that there's a great danger here, but also a great opportunity. It says, anyone who really wishes to be helped to attain the highest is in fact benefited by undergoing such a misfortune, by undergoing the kind of age that we're in, by seeing all the great things that we might identify with brought low by a bunch of people out there saying, oh, that's not any good, that sucks, you know, putting comments on pages or whatever you want, you know. The public is you know, not very well educated, has fairly poor tastes, so anything that's truly great, anything that's truly beautiful, it's not going to be a great fan of. Says, anyone who really wishes to be helped to attain the highest is benefited by undergoing such a misfortune, and must rather desire it even though people may be led to revolt. The really terrible thing is the thought of the many lives that are or easily may be wasted. I will not even mention those who are lost or at any rate led completely astray, those who play the part of the dog for money, but the many who are helpless, thoughtless, and sensual, who live superior, lazy lives and never receive any deeper impression of existence than this meaningless grin, and all those bad people who are led into further temptation because in their stupidity they even become self-important by commiserating with the one who is attacked without even understanding that in such a position the person attacked is always the stronger. It says, this is the leveling process at its lowest, for it equates itself to the divisor by means of which everyone is reduced to a common denominator. Eternal life is also a sort of leveling, and yet that is not so, because the unity that everyone should really and essentially be, because the unity is that everyone should really and essentially be a man in a religious sense, be a genuine individual, somebody who is responsible not to a faceless, nameless, human, abstract public, but responsible to something higher, something eternal, something that sees the heart, not just the outward appearance, that doesn't come to wrong conclusions and judgments, that can be relied on, whereas the public is mercurial. So Kierkegaard is offering an alternative here, and this is, again, very typically existential. The individual has to somehow free him or herself from the reliance that they allowed to come over them of buying into other people's ideas, buying into other people's way of life without truly thinking it through. And what you can see here is that existentialism is, in many respects, at least in the hands of Kierkegaard, a return to the Socratic idea of the examination.